These forbidden revolutionary books became Nelson Mandela's spiritual pillar during 27 years in prison. Here's how Mao Zedong's theories secretly transformed the man who freed South Africa and created a blueprint for liberation movements worldwide. Before starting the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. Picture this: Robben Island, 1964. The world's most famous political prisoner sits in his concrete cell, cut off from the outside world by one of the most oppressive regimes in history. Nelson Mandela has just been sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiring to overthrow apartheid. He faces decades of isolation, brutal labor, and psychological warfare designed to break his spirit. But hidden within packages of seemingly innocent books, his wife Winnie smuggles something that will change everything: the complete selected works of Mao Zedong. 4 volumes of revolutionary theory that will transform Mandela from an angry young militant into the strategic mastermind who will ultimately outsmart the apartheid regime. These weren't just books, they were weapons of intellectual revolution, more dangerous to the South African government than any bomb or bullet. And they would teach Mandela the most crucial lesson of his life, that true revolution requires not just courage, but infinite patience and strategic brilliance. To understand the magnitude of this intellectual contraband, we need to grasp the extreme risks involved in getting these books to Mandela. Winnie Mandela wasn't just a wife sending reading material to her imprisoned husband. She was conducting one of the most audacious operations of intellectual warfare in the history of liberation movements. The apartheid regime maintained strict control over what prisoners could read. Political books were absolutely forbidden. Anything that could inspire resistance, provide strategic guidance, or maintain morale among political prisoners was banned. Prison censors scrutinized every page of every book, looking for hidden messages, revolutionary content, or anything that could strengthen the prisoner's resolve. But Winnie had learned to think like a guerrilla fighter. She disguised Mao's revolutionary texts within religious books, academic volumes, and seemingly harmless literature. She established networks of supporters who could help move books through multiple checkpoints. She studied the patterns of different prison guards and censors, learning their weaknesses and blind spots. The selected works of Mao Zedong arrived in Mandela's cell disguised and distributed across multiple shipments. Volume 1 came hidden inside a collection of Chinese poetry. Volume 2 was bound within the covers of a Buddhist philosophy text. Volumes 3 and 4 arrived as separate academic papers on agricultural development in East Asia and historical studies in Chinese governance. Each delivery was an act of revolutionary courage. If caught, Winnie faced imprisonment, torture, and even death. The books themselves could result in additional charges against Mandela, extending his sentence or worsening his conditions. But she understood something crucial: that intellectual ammunition was just as important as physical weapons in the fight against apartheid. Years later, Mandela would say that these books became his spiritual pillar during the darkest days of imprisonment. But in 1964, as he carefully opened the first volume and began reading Mao's analysis of revolutionary warfare, he had no idea how profoundly these texts would reshape his understanding of liberation strategy. Mao Zedong's selected works wasn't just political theory, it was a comprehensive manual for overthrowing seemingly invincible oppressive systems. As Mandela worked his way through the 4 volumes, he encountered ideas that would fundamentally transform his approach to the liberation struggle. The theory of protracted struggle. The first revelation came from Mao's analysis of protracted warfare. Traditional African resistance movements had often focused on immediate, dramatic confrontations with colonial powers. The ANC itself had recently shifted from passive resistance to armed struggle, hoping for quick victories through sabotage and guerrilla attacks. But Mao taught a different approach. Revolution, he argued, was not a sprint but a marathon. The Chinese Communist Party had fought for decades before achieving victory, sometimes retreating for years before advancing, always thinking in terms of generations rather than months or years. For Mandela, sitting in a prison cell with a life sentence. This concept was both liberating and strategic. His imprisonment wasn't just personal suffering, it was part of a longer historical process. The apartheid regime's temporary victories didn't mean the liberation movement had failed, they were simply phases in a much longer struggle. Mao wrote, "A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle." Mandela underlined this passage and wrote in the margin, "Revolution requires revolutionary patience, revolutionary optimism in dark times." One of Mao's most powerful concepts was revolutionary optimism, the ability to maintain hope and strategic thinking, even during the darkest periods of struggle. Mao had written many of his most important works during the Chinese Communist Party's lowest points, when they were being hunted by both Japanese invaders and Chinese nationalists, when survival seemed impossible. "It is darkest before dawn," Mao had written. "We must have confidence that the masses are capable of destroying imperialism and reaction." For Mandela, reading this while performing brutal labor in the lime quarry of Robben Island, these words provided crucial psychological armor. The concept taught him to see setbacks as temporary and necessary parts of a larger victory. Every day he survived in prison without being broken was a victory. Every fellow prisoner who maintained his dignity under oppression was proof that the human spirit could not be crushed. Every act of solidarity among inmates was practice for the broader solidarity that would eventually overwhelm apartheid. The importance of ideological education, perhaps most importantly, Mao emphasized that revolutionary movements needed to educate their participants in both strategy and philosophy. Physical resistance alone was insufficient. Fighters needed to understand why they were fighting, what they were fighting for, and how their individual actions fit into larger historical patterns. This insight transformed how Mandela approached his imprisonment. Rather than seeing his time on Robben Island as wasted years, he began to view it as an opportunity for revolutionary education, both his own and that of his fellow prisoners. The political prisoners began organizing secret seminars, with Mandela sharing insights from Mao's works alongside discussions of Marx, Lenin, and other revolutionary theorists. They called this the Robben Island University, and it became one of the most important educational institutions in South African history. Mandela's genius lay not just in absorbing Mao's ideas, but in adapting them to South African conditions. The parallels between Chinese peasant revolution and black South African liberation were striking, but the applications required creative strategic thinking. Surrounding cities from the countryside. Mao's famous strategy of surrounding the cities from the countryside described how Chinese revolutionaries built support in rural areas before challenging urban centers of power. In China, this meant organizing peasants who vastly outnumbered city dwellers and were less effectively controlled by government forces. Mandela saw immediate applications to South African conditions. The apartheid regime's power was concentrated in white urban areas, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Pretoria. But the majority of black South Africans lived in rural areas, townships, and informal settlements that were poorly policed and often neglected by the government. Instead of confronting apartheid forces directly in their strongholds, liberation movements could build alternative structures of power in areas where government control was weakest. Township committees, trade unions, church networks, and community organizations could become the foundation for broader resistance. This strategy would later influence the United Democratic Front's approach in the 1980s, when anti-apartheid organizations focused on building mass support in townships and rural areas before challenging government power directly. The mass line. Mao's concept of the mass line, learning from ordinary people, developing policies based on their needs, and then mobilizing them for collective action, resonated deeply with Mandela's understanding of African political traditions. Traditional African societies made decisions through extensive consultation and consensus building. Chiefs and councils listened to community concerns, discussed options collectively, and implemented solutions that had broad support. Ubuntu, the African philosophy that I am because we are, emphasized collective responsibility and mutual dependence. Mao's mass line provided a revolutionary framework that built on these traditions while directing them toward liberation struggle. Rather than imposing ideology from above, revolutionary movements needed to emerge from the genuine needs and aspirations of oppressed people. This insight would prove crucial during South Africa's transition to democracy. Instead of imposing a revolutionary government through military victory, Mandela would lead negotiations that involved extensive consultation with all sectors of South African society, building consensus for transformation rather than simply replacing one form of domination with another. Revolutionary flexibility, one of Mao's most sophisticated strategic insights, concerned the need for tactical flexibility while maintaining strategic consistency. Revolutionary movements needed clear long-term goals but flexible approaches to achieving them. Be firm in principle but flexible in tactics, Mao wrote. This became one of Mandela's guiding principles, allowing him to negotiate with the apartheid government while never compromising on the fundamental goal of majority rule. During the 1980s, when international pressure was mounting on the apartheid regime, Mandela would demonstrate this flexibility by engaging in secret negotiations with government officials while the ANC maintained its armed struggle. Critics accused him of betraying the revolution, but Mandela understood that effective strategy required using every available tool: negotiation, international pressure, mass mobilization, and armed resistance simultaneously. What happened next on Robben Island was unprecedented in the history of political imprisonment. Mandela and his fellow inmates transformed their brutal incarceration into what they called the University, a clandestine educational institution that would produce many of post-apartheid South Africa's leaders. Secret seminars in the quarry, the limestone quarry where political prisoners were forced to perform back-breaking labor, became an unlikely classroom. While guards watched for signs of political organizing, prisoners developed elaborate systems for sharing knowledge and strategic insights. Mandela would begin discussions by casually mentioning concepts from Mao's works. "The weather reminds me of the Long March," he might say, and fellow prisoners would understand this as a cue to begin analyzing revolutionary persistence and strategic retreat. They developed an entire vocabulary of coded references that allowed them to discuss complex political theory while appearing to make casual conversation. Ahmed Kathrada, who had been a librarian before his imprisonment, became the informal coordinator of these educational sessions. He organized study groups focused on different aspects of liberation theory, with Mandela leading discussions on strategic thinking and long-term planning. Walter Sisulu, the elder statesman of the ANC, would facilitate debates about applying theoretical insights to South African conditions. Govan Mbeki, father of future President Thabo Mbeki, led sessions on economic theory and post-liberation development planning. These weren't academic exercises. The prisoners were planning the future of South Africa, developing the intellectual framework that would guide the liberation movement for decades to come. Transcribing revolution on toilet paper. The physical challenges of maintaining revolutionary education in prison were enormous. Books were limited and closely monitored. Paper for taking notes was scarce and suspicious. Writing materials were practically non-existent, but the prisoners developed ingenious solutions. Important passages from Mao's works were memorized by multiple inmates, creating human libraries that could be consulted even if books were confiscated. Key insights were written in tiny handwriting on scraps of toilet paper, which could be easily hidden or destroyed if guards approached. They created elaborate systems for sharing and preserving knowledge. One prisoner might memorize Mao's analysis of revolutionary timing, another would focus on theories of mass mobilization revolution. A third would concentrate on post-revolution governance principles. During their brief recreation periods or while working in the quarry, they would share their specialized knowledge, creating a collective revolutionary consciousness that was more comprehensive than any individual study could achieve. Mandela became particularly focused on Mao's writings about revolutionary leadership and strategic patience. He filled secret notebooks with quotes and commentary, developing his own synthesis of Maoist theory and African liberation practice, building revolutionary character. Perhaps most importantly, the prison university wasn't just about intellectual development, it was about forging revolutionary character. Mao had written extensively about the need for revolutionaries to develop selflessness, discipline, and unwavering commitment to the people's welfare. Prison provided the perfect testing ground for these qualities. Inmates who could maintain dignity under brutal conditions, who shared scarce resources with fellow prisoners, who refused to betray their comrades under interrogation, were demonstrating the character traits that revolution required. Mandela observed that prisoners who studied revolutionary theory seriously became more effective leaders, better able to maintain morale during difficult periods, and more capable of thinking strategically about long-term goals. The combination of theoretical study and practical testing created a unique educational environment that produced some of the most sophisticated political leaders in African history. The most profound impact of Mao's writings on Mandela was philosophical rather than tactical. Mao's theory of contradictions provided a framework for understanding how revolutionary change actually occurs, and this understanding would prove crucial when Mandela transitioned from prisoner to negotiator to president. Understanding contradictions in the enemy camp, Mao had written extensively about contradictions within oppressive systems, conflicts between different groups of rulers that revolutionaries could exploit strategically. Not all supporters of an unjust system had identical interests, and skilled revolutionaries could identify and widen these divisions. In apartheid South Africa, Mandela began to recognize several crucial contradictions. English-speaking white South Africans had different interests from Afrikaans speakers. Business leaders worried about economic sanctions while military leaders focused on security concerns. Urban whites had different perspectives from rural communities. International pressure created conflicts between those who wanted to maintain white rule and those who feared isolation from the global community. Most importantly, many ordinary white South Africans were not ideological racists but people trapped in an unjust system, fearful of change but not necessarily committed to oppression. Mao's analysis suggested that revolutionaries could potentially win over significant portions of the white population by addressing their legitimate concerns while maintaining firm principles about racial equality. This insight would prove crucial during South Africa's negotiated transition. Instead of treating all whites as irredeemable enemies, Mandela developed an approach that isolated hardcore racists while offering partnership to those willing to embrace democratic transformation. The correct handling of contradictions among the people. One of Mao's most sophisticated theoretical contributions was his analysis of how revolutionary movements should handle internal disagreements. Not all conflicts within liberation movements were the same. Some represented fundamental political differences that required resolution through struggle, while others were contradictions among people with shared ultimate goals that could be resolved through discussion and compromise. On Robben Island, Mandela observed these dynamics directly. The prison held members of different liberation organizations, ANC, PA Pan-Africanist Congress, Black Consciousness Movement and others. These groups had serious political differences, sometimes leading to conflicts that undermined collective resistance to prison authorities. Applying Mao's framework, Mandela worked to distinguish between contradictions that were antagonistic, requiring clear resolution, and those that were non-antagonistic, resolvable through discussion and mutual accommodation. Issues of fundamental principle, commitment to racial equality, opposition to apartheid, were non-negotiable, but tactical disagreements, personal conflicts, and organizational rivalries could be handled through dialogue and compromise. This approach helped create unprecedented unity among political prisoners and would later guide Mandela's leadership of the broader liberation movement. His ability to maintain ANC unity while building coalitions with other organizations became one of his greatest political achievements. Revolutionary patience and strategic timing. Perhaps most importantly, Mao's emphasis on revolutionary patience gave Mandela a framework for understanding his long imprisonment, not as wasted time, but as strategic preparation for more complex challenges ahead. Mao had written, "We are advocates of the abolition of war. We do not want war,
but war can only be abolished through war, and in order to get rid of the gun, it is necessary to take up the gun. This paradox, using the enemy's methods to eliminate the enemy's system, required sophisticated strategic thinking and perfect timing. For Mandela, this meant understanding that his imprisonment, rather than removing him from the liberation struggle, was preparing him for its most crucial phases. Every year of patient endurance was building the moral authority he would need to negotiate from strength. Every day of studying revolutionary theory was developing the intellectual framework necessary to guide complex political transitions. When secret negotiations with the apartheid government began in the 1980s, Mandela was ready with a strategic approach that combined principled positions with tactical flexibility, revolutionary vision with practical compromise, moral authority with political sophistication. When Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990, he carried with him not just the hopes of millions of South Africans, but a sophisticated understanding of revolutionary transformation developed through decades of studying Mao's strategic insights. The transition from liberation fighter to democratic leader would test every lesson he had learned from the selected works of Mao Zedong. The negotiated revolution, Mao's emphasis on strategic flexibility, allowed Mandela to pursue what seemed like a contradiction: revolutionary transformation through negotiation rather than military victory. Traditional Maoist theory suggested that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, but Mao had also written about the importance of winning over potential allies and isolating hardcore enemies. The South African situation in 1990 was unique in revolutionary history. The apartheid regime was militarily strong, but politically isolated. International sanctions were devastatingly effective. The black majority was organized and unified, but lacked sufficient military power to overthrow the government by force. White South Africans were increasingly desperate, but still capable of massive destruction if cornered. Applying Mao's strategic framework, Mandela recognized that negotiated transition offered the best path to revolutionary goals. Rather than seeking to destroy the enemy completely, the liberation movement could achieve fundamental transformation while offering former oppressors a stake in the new society. This approach required incredible strategic sophistication. Mandela had to maintain revolutionary pressure while engaging in negotiations, build international support while managing domestic expectations, prepare for possible military confrontation while working toward peaceful resolution. The negotiations at Codesa Convention for a Democratic South Africa became a masterclass in applied revolutionary strategy. Mandela used every tool Mao had described: tactical flexibility, strategic patience, understanding of contradictions within the enemy camp, mobilization of mass support, and clear vision of long-term goals. Building the Rainbow Nation, Mao's concept of unity through struggle provided the framework for Mandela's approach to post-apartheid reconciliation. Rather than seeking simple revenge against former oppressors, Mandela pursued what he called revolutionary reconciliation, transformation that addressed historical injustices while building a unified nation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission embodied this approach. Instead of Nuremberg-style trials that would have satisfied desires for retribution, South Africa chose a process that emphasized truth-telling, acknowledgement of suffering, and restoration of dignity. This wasn't naive forgiveness, but strategic nation-building based on revolutionary principles. Mao had written about the importance of transforming enemies into friends whenever possible. The apartheid system needed to be completely dismantled, but individual supporters of apartheid could potentially become citizens of a democratic South Africa if they were willing to accept majority rule and racial equality. This approach was controversial within liberation movements. Many ANC members wanted more punitive measures against former oppressors, but Mandela's deep study of revolutionary theory had taught him that successful revolutions needed to minimize ongoing conflict while maximizing transformation, economic transformation, and strategic compromise. One of the most complex applications of Maoist theory to South African conditions involved economic policy. Mao had emphasized that political revolution must be accompanied by economic transformation, but South Africa's situation required careful strategic thinking about timing and methods. The apartheid economy was integrated into global capitalism in ways that made Chinese-style revolutionary transformation impossible. International investors, domestic businesses, and millions of workers depended on existing economic structures. Sudden revolutionary changes could cause economic collapse that would harm the very people the liberation movement claimed to represent. Mandela's approach drew on Mao's emphasis on contradictions and strategic flexibility. Rather than attempting immediate socialist transformation, the ANC government pursued what could be called revolutionary gradualism, fundamental changes in economic ownership and opportunity, implemented over time to avoid disrupting productive capacity. The Reconstruction and Development Program (RDP) embodied this approach, combining immediate improvements in education, healthcare, welfare and housing, with longer-term strategies for redistributing economic power. Critics argued this approach was too conservative, but Mandela understood that sustainable revolution required building rather than just destroying. International solidarity and non-alignment. Mao's writings on international relations provided guidance for South Africa's post-apartheid foreign policy. Rather than simply aligning with either Western capitalism or Eastern socialism, China had developed a non-aligned approach that prioritized national development while maintaining strategic autonomy. Mandela applied this framework to position post-apartheid South Africa as a leader of developing nations while maintaining productive relationships with all major powers. South Africa's criticism of U.S. foreign policy, support for Cuba and other revolutionary governments, and leadership in African affairs reflected Maoist principles of international solidarity rather than simple gratitude to countries that had supported the liberation struggle.
The synthesis of Maoist revolutionary theory and African liberation practice that Mandela developed during his imprisonment continues to influence liberation movements worldwide. The South African model of negotiated transition has been studied and adapted by revolutionaries and democratic activists from Myanmar to the Middle East. The template for negotiated revolution, one of the Midel, the Ohanerdik to Pramit, Ninukan to peace and Toldor his power to Pragojan, Wanify. Mandela's success in achieving revolutionary transformation through negotiation rather than military victory has inspired liberation movements facing seemingly impossible odds. The key insights from his study of Mao's works, strategic patience, tactical flexibility, understanding of contradictions, and long-term thinking, provide a framework for achieving fundamental change without catastrophic destruction. In Myanmar, democracy activists studying the South African transition have applied similar strategies, building mass support while engaging in dialogue with military rulers, maintaining pressure for change while offering face-saving compromises to former oppressors. Palestinian negotiators have studied Mandela's approach to understanding Israeli concerns while never compromising on fundamental principles of equality and justice. The challenge of transforming enemy relationships into partnership while maintaining revolutionary goals remains one of the most complex problems in modern politics. Revolutionary patience in the digital age, perhaps most relevantly, Mao's emphasis on revolutionary patience, filtered through Mandela's experience, offers crucial guidance for contemporary activists facing global challenges that require long-term thinking and strategic sophistication. Climate change activism, economic inequality movements, and struggles for racial justice all require the kind of protracted strategic thinking that Mao described and Mandela exemplified. Quick victories are rare. Sustainable transformation requires building mass support, developing sophisticated strategy, and maintaining hope across decades of struggle. The Black Lives Matter movement, Occupy Wall Street, and climate justice organizations have all drawn inspiration from the strategic patience and tactical flexibility that characterized Mandela's approach to liberation struggle. The continuing relevance of revolutionary education. Mandela's transformation of Robben Island into a university demonstrates the continuing importance of ideological education within liberation movements. Contemporary activists working for fundamental social change need the same combination of theoretical sophistication and practical experience that prison study provided for South African liberation leaders. Modern social movements have created their own versions of prison universities, study groups, strategy sessions, and educational programs that combine revolutionary theory with practical organizing skills. The emphasis on developing both strategic thinking and revolutionary character remains as relevant today as it was during Mandela's imprisonment. As we reach the conclusion of this extraordinary story of intellectual transformation and practical revolution, we arrive at a truth that transcends both Chinese peasant revolution and South African liberation struggle. This truth speaks to every generation that faces systemic injustice, every individual who confronts seemingly impossible odds, every movement that seeks fundamental social transformation. Mao Zedong's great insight, which Nelson Mandela carried with him from prison cell to presidency, is that revolution is not a single event, but an ongoing process of human development and social transformation. The books that sustained Mandela through 27 years of imprisonment taught him that liberation requires not just changing who holds power,
but transforming how societies understand justice, dignity, and human possibility. The selected works of Mao Zedong provided more than strategic guidance. They offered a vision of human potential that transcended immediate circumstances. Even in the darkest moments of imprisonment, Mandela could maintain hope because he understood his suffering as part of a larger historical movement toward human freedom that was both inevitable and requiring constant struggle to achieve. Today, as we face our own versions of the challenges that confronted both Chinese revolutionaries and South African liberation fighters, systemic inequality, entrenched power structures, seemingly impossible odds, we need the lessons these texts taught Nelson Mandela. We need strategic patience that sustains long-term commitment to fundamental change. We need tactical flexibility that allows us to use every available tool for transformation. We need understanding of contradictions that helps us build coalitions while maintaining principles. Most of all, we need the understanding that revolutionary transformation is not just about changing external conditions, but developing the internal character necessary to build just societies. The prisoner who used forbidden books to maintain hope and develop strategy became the president who led one of history's most successful peaceful revolutions. When Mandela quoted Mao during his 1994 inaugural address, "It is darkest before dawn," he was acknowledging a debt that went far beyond personal inspiration. He was recognizing that the struggle for human dignity is global and eternal, that wisdom developed in Chinese peasant villages could guide African liberation movements, that revolutionary theory tested in prison cells could transform entire nations. The books that were smuggled into Robben Island as acts of dangerous love became the foundation for policies that lifted millions out of poverty, created new forms of democratic participation, and inspired liberation movements worldwide. Mao's ghost didn't just haunt China, it guided Mandela from prison cell to presidency and continues to inspire everyone who believes that fundamental social transformation is both necessary and possible. In Mandela's own words, spoken during his last major speech, "The long march continues. Each generation must discover its own revolutionary path, but we are not walking alone. We carry with us the wisdom of all who struggled before us, and we prepare the way for all who will struggle after us." The revolutionary texts that sustained a prisoner became the philosophy that freed a nation. Mao's theories of protracted struggle live in every liberation movement that refuses to accept injustice as permanent, and the synthesis of Eastern revolutionary wisdom and African liberation practice that Mandela achieved continues to light the way for everyone who believes that another world is possible. The books are no longer banned. The prison is now a museum, but the revolution continues, carried forward by anyone brave enough to study forbidden wisdom, patient enough to think strategically about fundamental change, and committed enough to spend their lives building the future that justice demands. Which revolutionary text gave you the courage to challenge injustice? How do you apply strategic patience to long-term social change? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation that began in a Chinese peasant village, traveled through a South African prison cell, and continues wherever people refuse to accept that oppression is permanent.